Um, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves first, Eric, while I'm letting some people in. I'll go ahead and go first. So my name is Nick Thompson, if we haven't met virtually or in person before. And along with Eric, I co-direct our state and federal advocacy efforts here at Texas Homeless Network.
Yes, and I'm Eric Samuels. I'm the president and CEO of Texas Homeless Network. And like Nick said, we co-direct our advocacy efforts, and he focuses more on the federal side. I focus more on the state side, but we help out each other a little bit on each of those sides as well.
A little bit of some housekeeping stuff before we officially get started with questions. So this is going to be recorded and posted later. You should have the option to have the automated closed captioning at the bottom of your screen as well. Everyone should be muted other than Eric and I, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We have a few questions that we want to get through first, and then we will have some extra time, hopefully, to answer some of those questions. If you have any technical needs, just go ahead and email, statewide initiatives at thn.org. We'll have someone watching that if anything comes in. All right, so this session is officially over as of the end of the day yesterday. There's been a lot that's happened this session on a variety of different sectors. So this is going to be focused on how this has impacted homelessness and housing policy in Texas overall. So it started in January and just ended yesterday. A lot has happened, and we're here to help catch you up on everything that happened. And I'll kind of be the moderator of this, and then Eric will be answering questions. Like I said before, feel free to use the chat box as well. Okay, Eric, so this session was a whirlwind to follow, even as someone that's in the field. Can you summarize for us and for the folks watching what we've seen this session as it relates to low-income housing and homelessness in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to start out with, you're right. It's been a whirlwind. At the beginning of the session, COVID was still on the top of everyone's mind. Not many of us had been vaccinated, so we were really thinking that during this session, because we were still taking a lot of precautions, we thought we might have a lot of opportunities to meet with legislators and testify, either using Zoom or some type of online platform. And so we had really high hopes that we could get our advocates from around the state to participate even more than they ever have. We also had really high hopes going to the legislative side. We had really high hopes that policy that would help expand affordable and permanent supportive housing, and a policy that would in general help people experiencing homelessness or people who work to help people experiencing homelessness would pass, because there were a lot of bills that would do all those things. In fact, there were probably more bills related to homelessness this session than there ever has been. So we started with high hopes. We did not end with high hopes. We did have some successes, but there were things that we would have liked to go on different, without a doubt. But in the beginning, we had housing policy that was focused on decreasing housing voucher discrimination. And we really hoped that policy would go forward and that legislation would be passed. I'll get into bill numbers later when we start talking about all that, but that was pretty much shut down from the beginning. And then there was legislation that would do things like help us to push forward our initiative, our homeless data sharing network initiative. And that made it farther than it ever has, but that eventually ended or did not get passed as well. What we ended up doing in the session, and what the session ended up being, is us playing defense and explaining to policymakers why bills like the camping ban bill and bills like the bill that would allow commissioners' courts to reject a purchase or a conversion of a facility to help people experiencing homelessness, why those things would be bad for us trying to end homelessness in the state of Texas. So I guess to summarize it, we started with a lot of high hopes, and not only about the legislation, but about participation. And as things progressed along, we really started focusing on, the bills that we saw as negative to our work and trying to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring.
I think I would definitely second what you were saying about being positive. I mean, I'm still positive about what we were able to do about connecting our advocates and then folks that are in the field currently experiencing homelessness with their legislators and their staff, because the option to do that over the phone or over Zoom was a huge change this session as compared to sessions previously. There's obviously still a lot of work to do, but that is one thing that I think that was positive that came out of this session. So getting a little bit to what actually did happen this session and what did pass. So a little bit of background, I think most folks on the call know, but roughly 28,000 folks experiencing homelessness here in Texas on any given night. Many of those are unsheltered as well. Unfortunately, this session, we did see an increase of interest of criminalization efforts for those experiencing homelessness, specifically around encampments and tenting, with HB 1925 and SB 987. So you touched a little bit about this on before, but can you speak a little bit more to how criminalization negatively impacts the work that we do and that our partners do across the state?
Yeah, so that was the bill that I think became the biggest part of our focus. That bill and the other bills related to commissioners' courts being able to reject projects. Those two garnered a lot of our focus, but criminalizing homelessness, obviously that's not a solution. Criminalizing homelessness only serves to put barriers up in front of someone who's trying to end their homelessness. If you find someone for living outside because they can't afford to live in a home or a housing unit, then what you're doing is you are criminalizing them. You are putting more barriers in front of them in the form of them having a criminal history. People with criminal histories will have a harder time accessing housing through our supportive housing programs, our public housing authorities, avenues like that. So it's certainly not a solution. And in no community, and I've said this to reporters a lot lately, in no community at any point in time in America that I've ever seen or ever read about, have we found that criminalizing homelessness or banning camping results in fewer people being homeless. All it really results in is pushing people into the shadows, pushing people behind our green belts and pushing them out of sight, which may not be the stated purpose of the camping ban, but seems to be the result of the camping ban. If we have policy that simply criminalizes an activity or a state of being, which is really what homelessness is, and we don't have that next step, we don't have that step that will allow someone an opportunity to escape that state, then really all it's doing is seeking to hide that issue and quite honestly just kicking the issue down the road. And that's what we were trying to convey to the legislature and the legislators that were voting on this. And unfortunately, it did pass. That bill, HB 1925, is going to the governor and probably will be signed shortly.
I think also what you were talking about with the intended impact of, or with the unintended impact maybe of these criminalization efforts, is I think most areas of Texas are very, very used to extreme weather events as a result of climate change and other things too. As we're thinking about this hurricane season that's starting today, as the Central Texas has had 3 weeks straight of rain, I think there's also an added note here about people being placed in more dangerous areas where they could be more subject to death or other injury as a result of these weather events because they're closer to these flood areas or things like that too. So there's absolutely an environmental and social impact of those things too. We do have one question on how this will be enforced across the state, if you wanted to go ahead and take that one.
That's a very good question, because I don't exactly know how it will be enforced. I know that in most communities, some 430 some odd communities, there are bills, or there are laws in place that are either camping bans or something that's the equivalent. So I am not certain if this will supersede those laws or if they can just use those laws as is. Um, I think we'll just have to wait and see how it will be enforced. I had a reporter also ask me, is this legislation in response to what Austin did? And I think it's very apparent that this legislation was in response to Austin decriminalizing camping. And that was really its focus. I don't know that there was a lot of thought given to a lot of other communities across Texas, large and small. So it's only time will tell how this will be enforced. And maybe even more importantly, only time will tell how the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs is going to identify and approve of public camping sites in these communities. I think that's a big job for an agency that's relatively small when you look at the overall state government here in Texas.
I
So sorry, I
do
don't have the answer.
I do
wish I
know
had
that the version that's going to the governor's desk, at least this was my impression of this, was that one, it would also have a preemption piece in there that would not allow cities to use public parks as sanctioned campsites. And two, would not allow cities or counties to opt out or otherwise dissuade their police departments from enforcing the ban. Is that your impression as well, Eric?
that the public parks, that definitely is the case. And that was that was brought up because Austin was looking at public parks as a potential place to put some of these public campsites. I don't know the details of that. I imagine that those public parks they were looking at were probably public parks that weren't used very often. But regardless, that amendment was put in there. So public parks can't be used for that. And you're right that there was language in there that identified that if a community chooses to do what Austin did, decriminalize camping, they can't. If they do that, they're going to face the possibility of losing state funding. And of course, in a lot of our communities, that state funding, even though it's not as high as it is in a lot of states, it's still very much needed. So that would be a huge blow to their work to ending homelessness. There were some really good amendments that we had senators and representatives throughout the process put in there. Arrest, I think, was taken out of the language. There were some other good amendments that helped a little bit to lessen the severity of this policy. But overall, what it is likely to do is it's likely to I don't want to say encourage, but it's likely to spur local law enforcement to more stringently apply laws that are in place, or this law in this case. And unfortunately, the people that will be most affected will be those on the street and their family members.
And getting to Kiana's question as well, and Kiana asked, are there plans to track the disparate impact on BIPOC folks experiencing homelessness in the state? My initial thoughts are, just because of the different municipalities and things of tracking these numbers, there may be some needed efforts from our partners around the state in order to actually obtain those correct numbers of how this will, and we know this will impact Black and Brown communities that are unsheltered the most as they interact with police departments.
Yeah, it would be really good to get those statistics, but I mean, we know that Black Texans are disproportionately, they face homelessness at a disproportionate rate to Texans that are white. I mean, 37% of the population in 2020 were Black or African American Texans, while only having 13% of the overall population. So I think it's fair to say that Black and Indigenous people and people of color will be disproportionately affected by this law. I mean, they're disproportionately affected by homelessness throughout our communities, no matter where our communities are here in Texas, and that's what it's been. For 20 plus years, we've been doing surveys and looking at data since 1999, and that's always been the case. This is not new. Luckily, this is something that we're actually paying attention to now and working on, and identifying that systemic racism is something that is a contributor to housing instability and homelessness, among other ills in our society. And it's something that we are facing now, finally, and we are working on as our communities and as our homeless response systems and within our agencies. So that's a step in the right direction, but unfortunately in the short term, people of color will be disproportionately affected by this. That's without a doubt.
So in thinking about racial justice as well, I mean, obviously we know, and our partners know, that racial justice fits into each and every one of our policy priorities in one way or another. From decriminalization efforts, impact of redlining, home ownership rates, gentrification, expanding access to services, access to identification was a big one. I mean, can you speak to some of the work that we did in this session that, I mean, we know what the other things that we were pushing, Eric, were not successful, but there were certainly steps that we took in this direction with your work with Housers, if you wanted to speak with that, the bill with Representative Vouchers, that kind of thing too.
I mean, I think the biggest thing that we worked on with Texas Housers, and we should applaud Texas Housers for their work. They are amazing advocates. They're there every day. We can't be there every day, but they're there every day, it seems like. The thing that we were most helpful about, the policy and legislation we were most helpful about, was through SB 265, which would have totally overhauled our housing policy in the state of Texas, and would have given us the tools to fight housing voucher discrimination. And unfortunately, that was not heard. That bill, and there were a few others. There was HB 886. I think those bills would have had a deep impact on our work, and would have allowed us more opportunities to house people, and would have, if not erased some of the discrimination out there, it would have given us tools to fight that discrimination, and give people more opportunities to be housing stable or get out of homelessness. Yeah, I mean, I think at the center of a lot of the advocates we worked with, at the center of their work, was a knowledge that systemic racism pushes a lot of these problems forward, and has created a lot of the issues that we face today that we're working with policymakers to overcome. And Nick, I know as we go through this, there are things that you want to add, so please do not hesitate to add those things.
Well, I think too, in thinking about this, state policy is only one tool that we have, right? So, and if folks are listening right now and they're thinking there's a lot that's bad that's happened during the session, I mean, obviously they would be right there. That's only one avenue though. With that, I mean, we're going to be focusing mostly on state policy here, but we have a lot of federal work that's in the pipeline as well, as long as that local work that can have the most impact on folks that are experiencing homelessness as well. So another big thing did happen right at the beginning of the session too, that I want to speak directly to. So we had the winter storm, the massive blackouts that happened for folks who do have shelter and power as well. But we lost over 200 Texans during during that winter storm and the power outages. We will never know the true number of folks experiencing homelessness who died during this time. I mean, just in terms of thinking about this session, and with the threat of intense summer storms as well, I mean, can you speak to what we'd hope to see the session in that regard and what we didn't see for our unsheltered neighbors?
Yeah, well, first of all, we know of 8 people experiencing homelessness who died during the winter storm. There's no doubt, though, that number's higher. That number's got to be higher across the entire state. I just think, that's just not reported in a lot of communities. And, that's really, I wouldn't fault anyone for that. It just is not reported the way, we would like it to be reported. So I think there was a bigger, effect on people experiencing homelessness than what we even noted. So I was there for hearings early on when, the Senate committees were listening to people about the power grid and strengthening the power grid and helping to put forth policy to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on any of that. I really probably shouldn't speak to much of it, but I do know that we were not able to enact policy that I think a lot of people felt would have helped us to strengthen our power grid and prevent things like this from happening again. So there's that. But on the side of the policy that we look at, one of the things that we would like to have seen would be, again, opening up more housing opportunities so we don't have people out in the elements and succumbing to the elements. So bills like Senate Bill 1567, I believe it was, that would have produced more permanent supportive housing through funding from managed care organizations. That type of legislation would offer more housing for people so they can get out of the elements. Again, the anti-housing voucher discrimination bills, those would have really helped quite a bit in getting people housed. And we just need to make sure that we are opening up opportunities and opening up opportunities to use housing vouchers as we continue on. You say we're now in our hurricane season. So it's likely at some point throughout this next year, we're going to face some situation where we're going to have people evacuate and need housing opportunities. And if they're not able to access housing units because of housing voucher discrimination, that's going to put them in harm's way. So we want to see policy like that passed. Then again, I go back to the data sharing network. If we were able to better share information on people experiencing homelessness in their households, that we are assisting to get out of homelessness between our 11 different homeless response systems, then we can more efficiently serve them. We can open up more opportunities for them to access housing and services. And that's especially the case during times of disaster, when a family might be evacuating from Houston to Dallas. That loss of information when they evacuate from one community to the next can delay their access to care, or it can create a delay or a roadblock in their continuity of care. So we would have loved to see legislation passed that would have made those things easier.
Going back a little bit to what you were talking about, the housing choice vouchers as well, I think this will be an important thing that you will probably hear Eric and I speak a lot to in the coming months as well. President Biden has included universal voucher access to folks who need it in his infrastructure and other plans. So that is one thing that we're working on the other side of things. However, with housing voucher discrimination in place in Texas, it would be a lot more difficult for folks to use those vouchers should they get better access to them to begin with. Veterans are already exempt in Texas, correct, from voucher discrimination?
That's correct, but we need to make sure to keep communicating that, because there are probably some communities that aren't aware of that. And so I'm sure that it still occurs. Yeah, you're right. We need any opportunity we have to use housing vouchers, we have to use them. Just lately, our public housing authorities were offered an opportunity to utilize emergency housing vouchers, our continuums of care, or our homeless response systems. Worked with those public housing authorities to identify which would participate in that. And I know most of them did, which is very encouraging. We need to we need to take advantage of every opportunity that we can to do that. HUD also is now offering CARES funding to help out in our communities so that people who are housing unstable, we can keep them in housing, but also people who are on the street, we can get them out of homelessness. And so every opportunity we have to do that, we need to do that. One of the ways that we can do that is through using some of that funding to convert old hotels into permanent supportive housing and help people exit homelessness and get the housing and the services they need. That's why I know I was focusing a lot on the negative earlier, but you're right, there were some positive things that happened. That's why that bill, SB 646 or HB 1803, that would have made it very easy for counties to reject the conversion or the purchase and conversion of a hotel for that purpose. That bill was not passed, and that was a very positive thing, because with all this CARES funding that allows us to do that, it would have been a real shame if we would have had that extra roadblock in front of us and preventing us from doing that.
So to recap on what did happen, that bill did die, along with most of the other ones that we're talking about, but the camping ban is the one that did make it through.
Yeah. I was going to say, that's right. The only bill out of all the bills that were focused on homelessness and focused on helping our work, the only bill that did pass was HB 1278. And what it does is it provides, or it calls for annually, a Texas Interagency Council for the Homeless meeting to be in a rural area 1 quarter every year. So,
well, that's good news.
It's still good news. It's still good news because we can get our state leaders to those rural areas, and those rural communities can talk to them directly. And that is good news. I wish we had more passed, but we did have that.
All right, we're going to get to audience questions here in just a minute. So if you've been waiting to put in a question, go ahead and put that in the chat box. I have a big question for you, Eric, the last one for me for now. So what would you like folks at the Capitol, the state legislators, their staffers, to know about the ongoing needs of Texan communities right now, in light of the ongoing pandemic and certainly its economic effects as well? So that's the first part, and I'll get to the second part after.
Well, I mean, I think we need to keep an eye on how this camping ban is implemented and make sure that our legislators know how that's going. And if it's not, I don't know what would be not going the way we want, but if it's not going the way it should, or if it is negatively affecting the work that we're trying to do, or people experiencing homelessness, I think our legislators need to know that. I think our legislators need to know how important access to housing and the development of more affordable, deeply affordable and permanent supportive housing is. And that, we've been saying that for years, but that still is important for us to continue to push. We also, we are coming out of COVID, but we're not totally out of it. I think our policymakers on the state, local, and federal level need to know that we need the tools. We need the access to services and housing in place so that we can better protect people who are on the street and people that work in homeless response. And we need the tools that will allow us to get people vaccinated, track those vaccinations, and encourage more people to get vaccinated in areas where we have low vaccination rates. I think that's going to be very important as we move forward through the summer.
So the next legislative session isn't happening until 2023. So in between now and then, what should the people watching both live and the recording of this later do in order to advocate for these systemic improvements on behalf of those experiencing homelessness, or the 1 in 8 renters in Texas that's behind on rent right now too?
Yeah, well, I think we just need to keep talking to policymakers. Just because this session has ended and the next one's not until 2023 doesn't mean that we still can't weigh in on issues. And this actually is a really good time for people to visit, their legislator. And if, they want to do that, we can help to facilitate that. We can go up to the Capitol with them. They can visit their local offices, which actually may even be more impactful. Sorry if you're hearing my stomach. It's growling like crazy. Um, it- so I think that we need to do that. And yes, what you're saying about, so we have had over a year of people struggling to make ends meet. We had an eviction moratorium for a long time. We don't have that in place anymore. And we're going to start seeing people that are going to be evicted. We definitely have people that are housing stable right now. What was that statistic you just gave, Nick? It's 1 of 7.
I think 1 in 7 was a couple weeks ago from the census pulse. I believe it's closer to 1 in 8 now that are behind on rent.
So it's growing. So at some point, that is going to snowball. And those people are going to not be able to pay rent. They're going to face eviction. And if we don't have the supports in place to help them, prevent them first from becoming homeless, some of them are going to fall into homelessness. And as more and more of them fall into homelessness, they're going to further stress our homeless response system, which, by the way, is already overly stressed. I mean, we can't keep up as it is. So we need to make sure all of our policy makers, all of our legislators, not just here in Texas, but in DC and locally, know that this situation is occurring. And if we can provide them with data, that's always good. But if you can back data up with anecdotes, that seems to resonate even more with policymakers.
Well, I think to clarify, Eric, I believe that the federal eviction moratorium is still in place until the end of this month, so June 30th, but the implementation of that has not been equal across communities, and those local versions of the eviction moratorium obviously vary quite a bit. Particularly in Houston, we're seeing a lot of low-income renters that are still being evicted for non-payment of rent, and of course, renters that are not being told that there is this protection in place as well. So today is serving for a lot of people as June 1st as a 30-day notice before those things will start to happen, potentially to thousands, if not millions of people across the country.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And, and our renters do have rights. We need to make sure that they know that they have their rights. Oftentimes they don't know what rights they do have. And also landlords are unaware of that. So we can always make sure to get that word out and get it out to, communities that will be in touch with people who are in this situation, or faith communities, or, civic communities, whoever we can, just to make sure that this knowledge is shared.
So with that, let's get to some of the audience questions. I'm going to start with Marlisa's. Her question is, what are some things we can do as members of the community to fight back against the criminalization of homelessness?
So, I know that there will be groups that will likely file suit, against this bill. And in some of our communities, they will explain that the implementation of this policy is not just because implementing this policy in communities where there are not adequate shelter beds or housing it's unfair to the people that are unhoused and camping. So that's likely to happen. I'm sure that will happen. I think, again, we can show legislators how this is negatively affecting people and keep track of that data so we can continue to show them month after month. I think it's one of the key things is we're going to have to see how it's implemented and how it's pushed out across the state. So when we see that, we'll have a better opportunity to talk about the negative impact of criminalization. We know criminalization is a negative, it has a negative impact on someone who is unhoused. So we just need to show it with data. And like I said before, anecdotes seem to go a long way with a lot of people in positions of power.
Right. And I think too, this is really really going to be, I think, something that's community specific as well. So getting involved on the local level as well, whether you want to volunteer with one of those groups or the service providers as well to try to help get folks into housing or other services as soon as possible. I think another piece of this too is that this conversation around criminalization of folks experiencing homelessness, particularly that are unsheltered, is happening in the court system on the federal level as well. So a large piece of this is out of our hands. There was a federal case that was decided in Idaho that said roughly that people can't be criminally punished for sleeping outside on public property if there's no available alternative, right? So, and the Supreme Court decided to reject the petition to re-see that case. So they upheld that specific ruling. Texas is not within the same region that case was decided in, but I think these differences in what's happening between the laws of one place and the decisions of one place and what are happening here are contributing to this larger conversation that the courts are having as well. So this is also a judicial issue where we may see this resolved that way as well.
Yeah, and I want to say this is not theoretical. I mean, I know of a group that will be working on this very soon. In fact, I'm meeting with that group a little bit later so they can explain to me, what they're working on. I don't want to name who that group is right now because I don't know what their plans are. But I know that there are groups that are looking into the legality of all of this as it applies throughout our Texas communities, if not the entire state.
Craig had a question about a special session. It's at least my impression right now that we are looking at a special session, but that we're not expecting anything housing or homelessness related to come up in that.
Yeah, so we are looking at a special session. I haven't heard the latest on that, but I know that main thing, I believe the main thing they're looking at is voting rights, or the voting rights bills. So that could be all that they work on, but I think we need to keep an eye out to make sure that, any legislation that's related to making it harder for us to find housing for people, we need to be aware of and make sure to educate our legislators on. But I don't believe that those bills are going to come up.
Well, and for sure the voting things do impact the communities that we serve as well. I mean, I think we should have the recording actually up on our virtual events page. We held a webinar a few months back with 2 different groups who've been working on the voting rights related stuff, but specifically about rights for voting rights for folks who are experiencing homelessness as well. So if you wanted to do that deep dive, we absolutely should have that webinar somewhere on our website as well for you to watch that. I see that Samantha just posted that link, so thank you.
Do we have any other questions that have come up?
Not that I can see.
I am very happy about the number of people who have shown up. Thank you very much.
So I guess my final question to lead us out, Eric, is what's next for people who are on this call? How can they get involved with us? What are we doing to kind of get at the root cause of these issues as well?
Well, I think you can make sure you're a THN advocate. You can sign up to be one of our advocates and stay informed. I think if you receive this, you might already be that. So just stay informed and keep allowing us to share information with you, but also share information with us. And if you want to get involved with your local office, either it's your state legislative office or your congressional district office that's local, we can help you get involved with them. And if possible, invite those folks, to visit with you and see your homeless response system. I think a lot of times you'll get some of our congressional delegation to come home during their breaks, and this is a good time for them to come see what you're doing, and they can come see what works, and they can have that knowledge when they go back to DC and start voting on policy that could help us all out. So I would just encourage you to stay involved and allow us to help you stay more involved and ease that communication if at all possible.
And I think the last thing that I will mention too, and let me pull this up real quick. Capitol Hill Day is virtual this year for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. They're particularly looking for folks with lived experience and or if you're working within the field of homelessness, which I know that many of you all are. So that link, if someone could post that in the chat real quick to go ahead and register. If not, I can go ahead and pull it. They're having a prep session next week for Capitol Hill Day as well. But I think that is it. I really appreciate all of you joining us today.
And thank you for your support throughout this session. It's been invaluable.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric and Nick.